Hi, everybody, and welcome to the April 2024 edition of the Q Community Updates. A new update, a new name for the session as well. So briefly to talk about that, we actually realized we had a bit of a naming issue, and so we're now calling these sessions the Q Community Update on the basis that we have a number of calls with the Q community. So to call this update the Q Community Call, it was just getting very circular. At least my head was melting. And so we're calling this the Q Community Update, which is, I've indicated here, we'll try to do sort of on a cadence of about once a month. And then all of the community calls are now categorized as discussions on GitHub discussions, just so that we can categorize them as such and just give them different names. We've got a fair amount to get through, so for folks joining live, if we can just leave the questions to the end or just ask them via the Q&A feature in the chat itself, that would be much appreciated. So let's just a quick look at the agenda. We're going to talk about project updates briefly, the evaluator, Q with other languages, and modules, a new section, Q and encoding, and Daniel will talk about that. Qlang.org and docs and content, Q Please LSP, and community updates as well. So very briefly, just on the project update side of things, as I said, we're aiming for sort of monthly cadence on these Q community updates. And we've linked to the last call there. We're doing a lot, if not exclusively now, all of our planning around different areas of the Q project via GitHub projects, and we're calling those roadmap projects. They're sort of the main parts of the project, and then we're doing what are called release projects for planning what goes into each release. As Daniel said, we've just before the call, we've calmed down a bit with our releases since the last community call, when I think we talked about 6 or 7 different releases. We've had a couple of releases since last time, but future releases, especially alphas in the 0.9 series, are linked from the 0.9 release project. So I think without further ado, then we can get into the first roadmap area, which is the evaluator. Marcel, I'll hand over to you.
Yep. I don't have controls of the slides, so somebody will have to click through.
Sure, happy to, yep.
Yep. Yeah, so all the evaluator updates are still, you can still see on the roadmap. I've been posting roughly every 2 weeks a little performance update about performance progress. So the main focus is still to release the new evaluator through an experiment initially. And I'll be taking a slightly different approach. So there's been 42 commits since last call. There's 13 open reviews, one of which includes the Q experiment. So that means that by the next release, next alpha release, there should be an experiment. Next slide. So unfortunately, we do not have all the errors fixed yet, but we're much further along than last time. So this is 95% instead of 87%. So this is the percentage is basically based on how many files are there with errors. So in reality, it's actually a little bit better because there's also less errors per file of the remaining files. So some of them had basically too many to count errors, and now they're actually listed as errors. So it's a little bit better than it might seem here. So as before, the P2 and P3 errors are mostly changes in error messages. So some of that is bad, right? Like less positions and stuff like that, but it's the same semantics between P2 and P3. And sometimes it's semantics that differs, like the error message is mentioned in a different location, but still, within what's reasonable. But that's also marked as a difference. And as I will discuss later, there's a slight shift of focus on basically not reducing the errors, but accelerating the evaluator more. So with the idea that we'll help more people faster with the new evaluator. But I'll give you some examples of that. Next slide. So here I have a bunch of examples of how the new evaluator is speeding up. So here we have an example where there's lots of embedded disjunctions. So the way things are counted in the new old evaluator is not entirely the same. So the new evaluator counts disjuncts less, which I've tried to compensate for in these counts, but conjuncts it's greatly overcounts. So so if you see the old evaluator conjunct being higher than the new evaluator, it's even better than it is, because the new evaluator very aggressively counts conjuncts much more than the old one did. So here you see, in this case, there's a huge improvement, and this is the result of being able to identify that these disjunctions all expand. If you take the cross product, they all evaluate to the same value essentially, and it's able to detect that very early, so it can eliminate duplicates very early. That's what's going on here. Next slide. So the previous one was this very sort of theoretical example. So this is one of the worst more examples that was derived from practice, and you can see it extends to here as well. So you see, well, the numbers speak for itself, right? So conjuncts is highly overcounted again in the new evaluator. So you see that this is really some significant improvements relative to the old evaluator in terms of number of operations. Next slide.
Just briefly on that one there, this is a very common pattern that people turn up and try to implement in Q. So this is like a super win for folks.
So do note on the previous slide, so it's common, but do note that there's a repetition of some of the definitions, which multiplies it even more. But that does happen in the wild also. Yeah. Next slide. So this is a simplification of the billion labs attack. So I wanted to be able to evaluate with the old evaluator as well. That's why I kept it smaller. So this is taken from a billion labs. You can find it on Wiki, which is most languages are exposed to this problem, including YAML. You can blow up YAML this way. So if you increase the size of the arrays and you have more nesting of the arrays, you easily go to billions of expand into billions of elements, right? So you can already see here it's growing quite quickly in the old evaluator. The new evaluator with structure sharing is able to identify which part of the structure are the same, and then use the same representation for that. So you see here that this is wildly small. Next slide. So here you see another example that is actually a problem in practice where you have lots of chaining. So this is a polynomial right now in the old evaluator. In the new evaluator, this becomes linear. So this is an ideal example. So if you start unifying these references with something else, like the structure sharing now will bail out. But we have some experimental implementations for the old evaluator, which we couldn't, in the end, include in the old evaluator for various reasons. Where we see that we can actually extend this for even these sort of combined cases where we only share the arcs of these nodes instead of the node itself, and then you can get similar linear behavior. So, but this gives you an idea of what you can, what kind of speed ups you can expect. So this is goes from polynomial to linear. Next slide. And then this is a nice example. This is also something that occurs in the wild. This is from a real example. So here you see how these two compound, so how the improvement in disjunction and structure sharing, so together improve things even more. So here at the top you see the old number of operations, then before structure sharing, but with a new evaluator you saw that it was already like quite a bit better. And then now you see together with structure sharing, this is massively better compared to these old implementations. So you see here there's a big improvement. Next slide.
Just Marcel, to emphasize for those listening in, again, to refresh on what we talked about on the community update last time, is that all of this has now been enabled by the new evaluator. It was just we hit a ceiling with the previous evaluator where doing these sorts of implementations was just not practical in terms of the amount of implementation effort. So this is really the fruit being born of the new evaluator here when it comes to the performance update side of things. Steve, if it's brief, we'll take it. Otherwise, can we take it at the end?
I hope it's brief. I'm not sure if
Okay.
I'm reading this wrong, but this looks like recursion, where a script contains a task and task contains a script. Are we permitting recursion now?
We always did. Yeah, it's just that there might be a structural cycle if it's not stopped, right? But in this case, the recursion occurs in a list type, so you need to feed it with the list type, right? So there needs to be new structure to perpetuate the recursion, right? And
Okay.
if you don't have the new structure, there needs to be either a disjunction or an optional field, or in this case, it's in the ... version, right?
Gotcha.
So which is the equivalent of a pattern constraint. So that's okay too.
Okay, thanks.
Yep.
But happy to come back to that. Yeah, because this is a very common pattern that people write when they're especially doing workflow related stuff. Sorry, next
slide. Yeah. So the idea is to rather than eliminate these P0 and P1 errors first, is to already roll out these structure sharing things. And this has several benefits. So first of all, we saw that the structure sharing, even though it's still not entirely bug free, it's mostly implemented, has still some little kinks. But what we saw is that it already fixed a lot of the outstanding bugs. So it introduced some new ones. So in the end, it's a wash, but it actually fixed some of the outstanding bugs, right? So rather than always going to 100% fix and then implementing the next feature, we actually benefit from already doing some of the restructuring work with these new performance improvements, because we can actually more easily fix some of these older bugs. So in aggregate, we actually move faster this way. So this is one argument. Another argument was that so some of the structure cycle detection mechanisms are not fully implemented yet in the new evaluator. And I realized that with structure sharing, it will be much easier to implement. So we now have sort of a hacky solution temporarily. And the idea is to pick that up after that. So we could see that some of the tweaks that we needed to do and some of the implementation are actually much easier if we already do some of the other performance improvements. So again, another reason that we could move much faster with doing this. And then the other another reason is like, okay, the main reason that people want to experiment with this new evaluator is so that they can see performance improvements. So the idea is if we can get as many of these performance improvements in, people can give us feedback where there's remaining issues, and we know that earlier, right? So we can also fix that faster. So there's many reasons to basically to have making this change. Next slide. So for the next steps to do, aside from releasing the outstanding CL chain, just like 13 or so, is fixing more of the bugs, of course. So we need to implement better structure cycle detection. So we either can mimic the old evaluator, but it's a bit complicated, and we have a better idea that fits with the new evaluator, which would simplify it tremendously and probably make it faster as well. So mind you that the new evaluator right now, it never frees memory. The old one was very optimized to reuse memory, right? So that it basically was much more efficient. So we don't do that in the new evaluator at all. So still it runs a lot faster than the old evaluator, even our tests, even the ones where you don't have these operation improvements. In aggregate, it's like twice as fast or something like that. But with those memory improvements, we should see a very big constant improvement as well. There's a lot of improvements there to do. That's also relative to the old evaluator. This still doesn't implement discriminator field, so that means that disjunctions, even though it's a lot faster, it's still polynomial. We can make that linear. We know how to make that linear in the vast majority of cases, but right now it's just not linear. Although it's quite good at detecting duplicates early, we can still make this a lot faster. Fine-grained structure sharing, a little bit more down the line, that will also improve things a lot more even. And then also in this process, so some of the constructs that were used in the old evaluator basically contributed to the error messages. And since that's gone now, we have less information for the error messages. So some of the error messages got worse, but we just need to find something to add that back. I don't think that's there are some other ideas to make this new evaluator quite a bit neater, and that would actually reintroduce that information. So it's just a little bit of tweaking. That's it.
That's your last slide. Epic
Yeah.
update on the basis that I think it's only been 5 or 6 weeks since the last call. We had targeted the end of March for this, and where we sort of slightly missed that. But as you've seen, there's a lot of work gone into these last 5 or 6 weeks, and we're very, very close to having the experimental version of this available with sort of benefits on the upside already, as Marcel said, on the structure sharing side of things.
Yeah, the
So
structure
thanks for
sharing
bearing
wasn't
with us.
planned for end of March.
Yeah.
So that's extra.
Yeah, so thanks for bearing with us on that. But we'll announce the alpha. I think we're targeting Thursday, but watch this space. Thanks, Marcel. Q with other languages, Aram, if I can hand over to you.
Yeah, so one of the most common feature requests for Q was the ability to be used from other languages, usually Python, but also other languages. So we're doing something to address this need. And since last community call, we basically have 2 new pieces of software. One is LibQ, which is a binding for the Q API to C. It's a very low-level thing. It's not necessarily designed to be used directly. Rather, it's designed to be used as a building block for high-level things. For example, we have a binding for Java. There are links in the slides. So we've done this work for Java. I will just note that all of this stuff is very experimental. I mean, we're actually literally having version 0.0 for these things, and they are in a state of flux. But they are working. The API is pretty comprehensive. There are some most notable things. Well, actually, there are only 2 things which are missing, which are iterators and lists. But other than that, everything works for Java. We are very, very close to having a user guide for Java. And once that is going to be in place in the news website, which we're going to also talk about in this call, we are going to address Python and Rust support. Roughly at the same API level as what we're doing with Java. We're also looking into ways of plugging this stuff into like the general package manager and so on, so it's like easy to install for people instead of having to go to GitHub. And of course, we're going to expand the API to support all the necessary features.
The goal here, Aram, I guess, to get when we announce these things via sort of like an initial version for folks to really kick the tires on these. The guides will help people get started on it. But are we looking for sort of feedback on how to make the APIs more canonical? What's your thinking on what feedback we want from people at this stage?
Yes, so we're definitely looking for feedback when it comes to things like making the code idiomatic, and even people just telling us what kind of features they need. For example, now with Java, users have to manually install LibQ as a shared library, and then it just works in Java. But maybe they don't want that. Maybe they want like an automated solution where they have a single thing and it all works, which will be the case for Python. So for Python, we will statically compile everything. So if you just install the Q library, it will just work. But these are like platform-specific decisions and idioms that we do not necessarily have experience in, and we don't necessarily know what people expect or want. So we definitely want that sort of feedback. But again, also feedback on things like idiomatic APIs and that sort of feedback.
Good. And I think the one thing we should do beyond the user guides of just here's how to use Q with Java is, for example, and this is a real case from the wild of where people want to sort of perhaps sort of tutorial or concept guide where they say, oh, they want to have this one piece of Q that is evaluated in different scenarios in a Go program, in a Java program, and a Python program. This is a real world situation where people want to effectively consolidate business logic, whatever it might be, between these use cases. So this will really help to drive that sort of use case, I think, when it comes to Q being used as like an effective single source of truth. Awesome. Thank you very much indeed. Modules, Rog?
Yeah, so we have now, we have actually launched an experimental central registry repository for Q modules, so that well, certainly in the end, everyone will be up to upload to and download from. Currently, it's experimental. It's invite based. Next slide, maybe. So it's invite based. It's restricted to GitHub based modules for now, because that means we can piggyback on GitHub authentication and also GitHub authorization. So you're allowed to upload modules for you're allowed to interact with it if you're a member of an organization. That means that made it quicker for us because we didn't have to implement all the all the various ACLs and whatever. In the future, that will be expanded. You can, but for now, yeah, you can request an invite in Slack or via email and play with it yourself. And yeah, the registry.q.works is the name, and we're really hoping for as much feedback as we can get.
Just to quickly jump in there, the goal really for the central registry being a well-known place for well-known modules for well-known software as sort of like a strapline for it. So, and we'll come to talking about this in the sort of the next steps. But the fact that the central registry is there live, and we'll talk about it in a second, there's some documentation that shows how to use the central registry. That's already up there and running, so folks can literally, and we'll drop this requirement for requesting invites shortly. We're just trying to kick the tires on things to start with, so hence just wanted to somewhat arbitrarily rate limit how much activity we're getting on there. But we're looking to drop that as that requirement soon, and so then folks will just be able to self-sign up.
Yeah, I suppose that one thing one could say is that Q is by no means limited to using one particular registry. Everyone can use their own registry.
Absolutely.
But the hope is that the central registry becomes a sort of de facto place for a common namespace where everyone can agree, where I import this is what that import means. And the way that import paths are set up is that they're domain name based, so you can always create your own space without risk of collision with something that is in the central registry.
And just briefly on that point, Roger, as well, a number of people who've already been experimenting with Q modules in like private company settings with existing OCI servers, then setting up a means by which we can sort of replicate from the central registry to those private registries, so that folks who do want to maintain their own registry of artifacts, whatever they might be, and have Q be a subset of that, can also benefit from that common namespace that is maintained in the central registry as well in a seamless way.
Yeah. Next slide. So yeah, so as I said, central registry is live in alpha mode. We've also implemented various new features. Like the first one is like, well, how do you actually log into the central registry when you have an invite code? Well, Q login is the standard way of doing that, and that takes you through a browser page which allows you to log in with your GitHub credentials or your GitHub authorization. We've implemented, when talking to registries of your own, it's quite common that it's not obvious what's going on, and it was quite opaque. Now you can log all HTTP requests in a reasonably safe way, so it tries to avoid logging auth credentials and that kind of thing. So by setting qdebug equals HTTP, which is super useful sometimes, particularly for reporting bugs. Not that there are any bugs, of course, but there might be bugs. So if you do find a bug, then sending that log is useful. We've got a qmod tidy check mode. So if you want to, one of the things about the central registry is it checks whether your module is tidy. It has all the dependencies. It's well formatted when you're uploading a module. This means that with -check, you can do that. You can do that check without actually running the tidy. So that's much faster in most cases. Very useful in CI, as Daniel says. It's basically a shortcut mode that doesn't actually go and actually do the tidying. It just checks that it is tidy. And there's some module help. There's also there's some new content, that module related content that Paul will talk about later. Next slide. The various small some not so small fixes. So there was a bug in, so when you can have a registry configuration that configures how your modules are stored in your particular registry to conform to various registry restrictions. There was a bug in strip prefix, which is annoying, but that works more properly. People are using it. If you actually mention packages in the command line, that didn't work either. And then there was an interesting issue around, I think it was GitLab's registry, which meant that it was always returning a 401 error, even when you just acquired a valid token and used that. And this was a pain because actually, if you get an unauthorized error, that's usually like there's nothing you can do about that. Or like if you acquire a token and then reissue your request with the valid token, you shouldn't get a 401 error. You should get a forbidden error, or perhaps a not found error. If you do genuinely get an unauthorized error, then you should probably treat it as permanent because there's something you can do about that. But GitLab was not doing that, so we had to put in basically a hack for that says if you've got the 401 error and you've just acquired a token, well, then you should probably just treat it as not found. This issue was particularly the case when we're doing qmod tidy, and it's actually searching the registry for lots of prefixes of your import path to try and find a repository that is valid. But so it has to try all those possibilities and discard the ones that are just not found. But in this case, it was erroring out because it was saying, oh, it's unauthorized. Oh, there might have been a package in there or a valid module in there. So anyway, that's long story short, that seems to be fixed now. But as always, there are a million registry implementations out there. We're trying to work with all of them. So please try it. If you know of any unusual registries, and please try them with Q and see what happens. And we'd love to find you.
Thank you for adding some integration tests with actual real-life registries as well to help make sure we don't regress against them and they don't regress against us. So that is something that is still on the to-do list.
Yep, absolutely. That's going to be really important in the past. So there's one thing that we're actually going to talk about more. There's a modules update call on Thursday, which we'll talk about this more. But one discussion that came out from the fact that somebody was unable to upload their module because there was a file in there which was git ignored, which would have gone into the module. And this led to quite a wide-ranging discussion around security issues of uploading modules, and as eventually ended up with the decision, at least temporarily, at least interim decision, that when publishing, we'll require a source field in the module.q which says what kind of source, what kind of VCS the module comes from, and then if that's there, that has to be there on publish, and then we'll actually look for the Git directory and use the Git as a source of truth for deciding what files to go into that module on upload. You can explicitly say none, and then it will just basically behave the same as it does now. But that also means having that source there means that we'll have some way of verifying or validating when a module is in a registry, and we know where it's come from, what the process is that's gone into creating the files in that module. So for validation purposes, there've been various code injection attacks recently, which have been relied on uncertain connection between source and result, and this is one way to help in that kind of security. Avoid that kind of security issue. Most of that isn't implemented yet, but it's a step towards that.
Yep.
And as I said, we've got these module feedback calls regularly every 2 weeks. Please come along and have your say, and we'll update and we'll talk about modules in general and what we're doing. Another interesting thing that we're doing is we want the ability to automatically generate documentation like pkg.go.dev from Q modules. Now, this is a quite an open-ended area, because like exactly how to specify how the best way to do this is not always clear, but we're experimenting with that, and that's work in progress. Another thing that we want to do is having like some sort of service or something along those lines, to make well-known modules available, like Kubernetes related modules, GitHub Actions, that kind of thing. And the idea is that when it comes to it, you should be able to say, I'm using Kubernetes version X.Y. Give me the configuration that corresponds to that. That's the kind of overall thrust of the that's what we want to try and make easy to do. How exactly to do that? There's still a lot of open-ended questions, but that's where we're heading. Next slide.
That is your last slide.
That's my last slide. Stop talking then.
But yes, there are a number of open-ended questions there. But just to sort of ground that, is we are going to be concretely experimenting with specific things like Kubernetes, GitHub Actions, whatever it might be, well-known schemas to help form those ideas, so that folks can, via the central registry, actually start making progress on a quick start with, say, GitHub Actions, and in 5 or so commands be up and running with GitHub Actions and Q, for example, or the same with Kubernetes. Cool, Rog, thank you very much. Great that the central registry is out, and we'll talk about the documentation, as you said, in a second. Daniel, can I pass over to the encodings kickoff?
Yep. So we thought to ourselves, we're not doing enough projects as it is, so let's start another one. But more seriously, we did plan on doing some encoding work in 2024. And now that modules is starting to stabilize, I've transitioned mostly away from modules and into working on encodings. So to clarify, what we mean by encodings is encoders and decoders into other languages. So think QExport, QImport, and also packages like encoding YAML, package encoding YAML, also for the standard library and so on. So we do have a GitHub project of the roadmap kind that's linked there. I'm testing a feature within GitHub projects called status updates. So at the top right, you can click on the current status and you should be able to see a history of project updates. We'll see how well that works. We also have a Slack channel now called Encodings. That channel used to be called CodeGen, so I repurposed it. It wasn't being actively used for almost 2 years. And then the main objectives over the coming weeks are pay much needed attention to existing encodings, mainly YAML, but also a few others. Implement prototypes for encodings that are very much needed and are missing. The main ones are TOML and INI, but I'm sure there will be others that people will tell me about. And then harmonize the existing and new encodings into a common Go API interface. Because right now, there's no easy way to sort of use any number of them in a generic way. Each one of them has a slightly different Go API that makes that quite difficult. Next slide. And no, we will not talk about XML. Thank you, Roger. So here's a screenshot of what the project currently looks like on GitHub. You can see that I've started turning some of my planned items into GitHub issues, as well as reusing existing issues like INI. But if you scroll down, some of them are still drafts because they're work further along the pipeline that is not well thought out yet, so they're not issues yet. But that is roughly what my thinking is for next steps. And next slide.
I did just try and scroll down, Daniel, as you said, scroll down, but let's pretend I didn't do that.
I did set that up. So in terms of in-progress work, I have been working on encoders for, I would say, a solid 3 weeks now. So the first thing I have mostly finished is a new YAML decoder, because the existing YAML decoder uses a fork of the Go YAML library that Marcel did in 2019. There were reasons back then to do it. Nowadays, it makes less sense, and it's also become a bit of a burden. So the new decoder mostly works. It's better in some ways, slightly worse in some others, but overall, I would say it's better. And we're going to release it as an alpha experiment very soon. That's the CL, if anybody wants to go look at it. I also did a prototype faster version of file types. I'm not going to go into why that matters, but there is a fairly long commit message that explains why that matters in the second CL link there. And then the next item on my to-do list is a prototype of TOML. And the issue number is 68, meaning that people have wanted this for a long time. And if anybody has any input or ideas or feedback, I'm in the Encodings Slack channel.
That's super. And yeah, there's other encodings that you think we should be focusing on. Happy to sort of entertain working out how we prioritize and work out which one should come next. But I think, Daniel, that key bit being that we're using a lot of this early work here to discover whether there's a common shape to decodings and encodings that we should be following here.
And something I forgot to mention is that I'm not only interested in feedback on my work on encodings. If anybody wants to contribute either a new encoding or improvements with an existing encoding, please still very much reach out, because there's no reason for only me to be allowed to work on encodings, right?
One thing I should also call out as well is a couple of companies who have internal configuration formats have contacted us to talk about how we can adapt Q or encode Q to and from their language. So that is also something that we are happy to sort of try and prioritize and work out how it fits in as well, because it is the case that there are custom configuration formats, and it is very much a stated goal that we want Q to be able to speak lots of different types of languages, whether they be just data languages and or schema languages or something in between. So please get in touch. Anything else on encodings? No, great. Okay. I'll quickly skip through the qlang.org side of things. We finally released the new qlang.org site I think it was on the morning of KubeCon, which was great. The feedback we had, especially at KubeCon, because we were there live at the time, from new and existing users has been fantastic. So thank you to those who have given it a try. The one thing that folks really like is that the examples that are there are now, they haven't bit rotted in any way. They are real, they're live, that they can be copy pasted and people can try things out. So there was a follow on from that. Folks have really liked the new playground and the fact that we've talked about that we will enable different modes in the playground. So for example, if you want to demonstrate to someone how to use Q to validate some JSON, we would have like a 3-pane setup there with a Q input, a JSON file to validate, and then perhaps a fake terminal as well that shows the validation output. So we are going to be adding those different modes to the Q playground, but that's all now sort of enabled by the fact that we finally got qlang.org live. So thanks to everyone who's given feedback and just positive support on what's gone out there so far. We're now going to be switching focus back to Q by example. Given that we had a real push to get qlang.org out, we will continue to do content for qlang.org. The process for actually writing content for qlang.org is considerably simpler as well from a maintenance perspective. So that really will help us to just, as Jonathan is and others, Noam, I see you on the call. Thank you very much for contributing. It's really great to have just new content being contributed and keeping it live and relevant to what it is that people want to see up there. So thank you. Q by example, as I mentioned earlier on with the module side of things, we really want those to be really modules. Sorry, here are some of the new areas of content. I'll come back to Q by example in just a second. New areas of content on qlang.org. We briefly touched on these last time. And here is the publishing modules to the central registry example. This is, again, live. It needs a slight tweak, this one, on the basis that you need to adjust for your own GitHub username and repository. And we're trying to work out how to sort of improve on that so that you can literally copy paste such an example. But this is one of those guides where you do need to do some tweaks locally as you're going through it. Next steps, this is where I should really talk about Q by example. I've already talked about qlang.org and more content and better categorization and the playground. We really want Q by example now to be fleshed out, where we can have these quick start modules driven examples of how to get started with Q and X, right? And the central registry is going to be a key part of that, so that folks don't have to run 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 steps to get started with something locally. You should be able to bootstrap really quickly from what is there in the central registry and with good documentation. So that's the focus. The qlang.org roadmap, docs and content roadmaps linked from there, but of course it's closely related to what we're doing on the central registry as well, especially when it comes to things like the documentation experimentation as well. So that's it on the qlang.org side of things. The QPlease LSP, I have to be honest, there's much less to update on this since the last call than I would have hoped. The focus has been on KubeCon. getting qlang.org live, and getting the central registry live as well, which has actually it's taken a significant amount of time and effort since then. Everyone's worked super hard to make that happen, but it has taken away my time on the LSP side of things. However, we did have a good kickoff with the author of the JetBrains plugin, and have agreed a plan on how we're going to harmonize the JetBrains plugin, leveraging the LSP as that starts to get built out. So that will mean that folks in the JetBrains world can, via a bridge effectively to the LSP, start to rely on all of the capabilities of the LSP without that needing to be re-implemented in any way on the JetBrains side of things. As some sort of reassurance that I am going to return to the LSP now that qlang.org is live and the central registry is live, I have focus time blocked out on the LSP. The LSP initial implementation did go out with 0.8.0 to briefly update on that, and I've now sketched out what the next steps are on the LSP itself, with the go-to definition being the first thing that will be implemented next. A couple of sort of project-related moves of moving treesitter to qlang on the basis that I think we can actually start to leverage the treesitter declaration as perhaps a source of truth, even when it comes to things on the JetBrains side of things, but it's more just a consolidation than anything. And then the 2 points down at the bottom there, the implementation of AST healing, as I've referred to it, is something that will be necessary within the LSP. And then implementing a basic form of caching of quotes artifacts within the LSP as well. The performance of the LSP is going to be very closely related to the performance improvements on the evaluator side of things, especially when it comes to reusing previous work as well. So we'll be working closely with Marcel's performance side of things, might even start to be focused around what it is that we're seeing via the LSP and how we can optimize those sorts of things as well. So we should see some nice improvements in the LSP side as Marcel's evaluator changes and improvements start to land as well. So it'll be a good test for the new evaluator as well, as much as anything else. That is it on that side. Daniel, can I hand over to you for a quick release update, please?
Yep. So last time I gave a release update, we had done about a bazillion releases. So this time it's a little bit easier. As a reminder, we have 2 active release projects on GitHub. One of them is for 0.8. Even though 0.8 is finished, we may need to do another bug fix release. It's not planned for now, but the possibility is left open. And then we've got the project for 0.9 to continue with the alphas and on the way to the final 0.9.0 release. We did a bug fix release in early April to backport a few bug fixes to 0.8. And we also did the first and only alpha so far for 0.9 in late March. And we haven't done another release since then because, like Paul said, we went to KubeCon. Things were we're focused elsewhere. But we plan to do Alpha 2 by the end of this week with a bunch of stuff that we've already mentioned. And here's a screenshot of the 0.9 project on GitHub. If you want to get an idea of what we very much intend to be included in the release, we'll see how it ends up turning out the rest of this week.
Super, thank you. Dominic, briefly on community updates.
Yeah, moving towards a community update. So as mentioned previously, we were at KubeCon, which was a great success because it's always good to interact with people also face to face and collect feedback and insight. So yeah, it was a good success to learn and get great feedback. We started already last time to visualize and illustrate what we're doing in some sort of roadmap on GitHub. Feedback was very good so far because it helps to understand where we are, what we're working on, and where we plan to go. So we continue to do that and probably even extend on that channel. And as always, everything is very much informed by feedback we are getting. The main channels of feedback are GitHub and Slack. So everyone who's listening, also watching this videos, please engage there and give us valuable feedback because this is insight that will then be translated to to-dos on the roadmap. And on a different note, different to the channels we have here, it's always great to have like separate calls with the users to get like a very focused understanding what people are doing with Q, what the use cases are, what the pain points are. And we've done so in the past. Every one of those calls was very insightful. So please reach out. We would like to understand what you're doing with Q. So yeah, no hesitation, please. And
Thanks
next-
to those, yeah, just briefly, thanks to those companies and projects who have been in touch since the last call. Again, it is fascinating and sort of somewhat frightening at times to understand the very different ways in which Q has been being used in different situations. But great, because as Dominic said, it's really helping ensure that we've got the right focus on the relevant areas of the project, and that we're actually sort of meeting people's, if I think about the modules example, with the central registry and those well-known modules, that we're meeting people where they're at in terms of the problems, from like getting started or helping people get started, or the LSP, making it easy to give feedback to people. So hopefully we got the right focus on things. If we haven't, we really want to use those sessions with folks who are using Q or thinking about starting with Q to understand where we haven't quite got the right focus. So please be in touch.
Yes, and we will continue with those kind of calls. Basically, again, this is entirely based on the needs of the community. So this might change at all times. Right now, we have another modules feedback session planned this week. We'll continue with like every 14 days. I was about to say bi-weekly, but we're not doing that. Every 14 days, an update session. We will do performance updates, mainly written right now, and we will continue to do with those community updates and docs and content calls. But again, the more feedback we collect, the more insights we have, we might change this, add different forms of calls, different areas of updates in different channels. Yeah, it's entirely based on what we learn. So let us know.
Thank you. I think the written performance updates are working very well in terms of folks being able to sort of digest that in an easy offline fashion. So we'll carry on with those. But very happy to, on a related note, if folks do want to talk about details of, say, the evaluator or anything, Marcel's offer of office hours sort of on an ad hoc basis, that absolutely remains open. So really happy to do that at any time. What's next? This is just a summary, really. Marcel, we're going to enable the new evaluator of our own experiment, and really then look to be guided by experience that folks have in the wild. And as I mentioned, the LSP might well be one such source of ideas on where we focus there, but people actually trying the new evaluator with their configurations will also be too. The central registry is going to be one of the, one of the main focuses on the module side of things, especially this making available somehow of well-known modules in that well-known place. Daniel's talked about the encoding side of things and new sort of focus, and how we're going to enhance Q's ability to speak different languages as you like, and starting out there with work on the YAML side of things, but then exploring TOML, any and other encodings to sort of get our feet wet there. QLang.org, that's now live. We're now shifting back the focus to Q by example to ensure that we're being driven and sharing with folks real life examples that are easy to get started with on how to use Q in the wild. And that'll be enhanced by, as we talked about, making well-known modules available in the central registry. And as Aram talked about, the cross-language Q, again, being driven by what real users are, I'll try that all again. What users are finding in real world situations is what I was trying to say, of where they want to use Q as a logical single source of truth between languages, between programs written in multiple languages, and so really building on that, the Java and the Python side of things, with docs, as I suggested, which will help folks to see and visualize how Q can be used as that logical source of truth. And so taking a deep breath, we reach the Q&A section, and apologies for that being quite a long update. We did hope for it to be slightly shorter, but there was a lot to update on. So if folks have any questions, happy to entertain those now. Steve.
Yes, I haven't followed the discussion closely enough, so I'm sorry if this has come up, but regarding the modules with the central registry, thinking of, let's say, Kubernetes as an example, you can run, Q go get, whichever way it goes, spit those out. And they're useful only to a point. I know that when I was using them, I had a bunch of in-house enhancements, I'll say refinements, that I had overlaid over them in my module directory. And I'm wondering, when we talk about having, let's say, a single reliable source for that stuff in the central registry, do you expect that you'll have just one of them? Would you encourage contributions that attempt to layer over other modules, that sort of refine and make the constraints more specific?
I think it's a good question. I'll let Rog chip in here as well. Rog and I spent, I think, 3 or 4 hours just sort of talking about this morning, and it was actually an active area of conversation on the last modules update call as well. I think, Steve, it sort of really depends on how things evolve here. You're absolutely right to identify QGetGo as like a key building block in, say, the Kubernetes side of things, where the Kubernetes situation is certainly not unique. But I'll just observe that it is based in Go as a source of truth. And it's not the only situation, because GitHub Actions, for example, has JSON schema as a source of truth. And there are others where protocol buffers is a source of truth. So there's quite an interesting landscape of, if you've got Q as the source of truth, let's just say that's the easy one, right? And so in that situation, Q is the source of truth, and there's no need for enhancements because that Q module is really the source of truth. That point. So where is something derived? I think there's quite a few things to work out. But as Roger was talking about earlier on, that whole where he articulated it really nicely when he said, "Thing is, we're trying to come at it from the right-hand side." I know it looks like it's to the left for you here, but from the right-hand side, the end user. I'm using Kubernetes version 1.29.0, whatever version we want to talk about there, and say I want to configure Kubernetes using Q. Just like a broad problem statement like that. And then work out, okay, well, where does that person go next? And so to get to the crux of your question of, well, is there one place? I don't think we can ever imagine enforcing there being one location, because that's just not the reality of what a package management ecosystem entails. As in, the Go ecosystem has many different YAML implementations, just to take one example. But people tend to then gravitate towards one that is very well maintained and has got a good structure behind it. And so I think there's a sort of a problem of like discovery there, but one that I think in an approach that is similar to what they do on package.go.dev, we're looking to try and follow on the Q side of things. And again, back to Roger's point about, well, things being domain name based as well. I think that it's likely going to be the case that there are then trusted namespaces that people will look towards for well-maintained modules, for example. So if, for example, when we extend to support like custom domains, the Kubernetes stuff is hosted under K8s.io, well, that's a very obvious place to start, for example, for the Q-based version of what it is that someone would otherwise consume on the Go side of things. So I think there's a number of things to sort of work out in terms of like the discovery, the social side of things, how people want to actually maintain and support these refinements or the enhancements that you're talking about, how they can be overlaid on top of like the raw generated building blocks that come from the likes of QGetGo. And I think also as well, working out what the building blocks of such a system, if I can describe it like that, actually look like. So QGetGo sort of feels like one. Q import on the JSON schema is another side of things. But there's plenty of moving parts around that I think we've just got to try and do a bit of a scope explosion on, and then a scope reduction to say, and now we're going to get something in everybody's hands where they can really start kicking the tires on it. But we had a really good call. Cedric and Richard were on the previous modules update call. I might refer, Roger, I'll hand over to you to see if there's anything, because I think that last call was a very good one in terms of how it went.
Before I do, maybe Richard put up his hand and maybe had a Richard?
Oh, no, my question, I had some questions that were separate from modules.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, Paul's said it all really. We don't, like, the short answer is we don't know exactly how we're going to build, exactly what we're going to build here. We know where we kind of have an idea where we want to get to. And when you're talking about enhancements, I think, one of the things is there are actually many possible reasons for enhancing, and maybe that makes a difference why you're doing it. But, because there's like, we're enhancing this because we're bringing it closer to the idea of, this schema as understood by Kubernetes v 1.29 versus like, oh, well, we're enhancing this because in our company, when we're using Kubernetes, we expect all service names to correspond to this schema. Like, for example, this restriction. I don't know if those are the same thing or they're not, right? And maybe they amount to different things. Maybe so. This is all stuff we have to work out. And if you have ideas, and in this space, because I think as much as anything, it ends up being a social problem as well as a technical problem, because we have to collaborate on these things. These particularly the enhancements that they're things or Marcel calls them tailorings, which there's no canonical way of automatically getting those from the queue, so has to be some human input at that point. So that at that point it becomes more of a human issue and a collaboration issue, and how to make that work well and produce the end result that we want. So for someone to be able to say, I'm using this version of Kubernetes, give me the schema that it understands. That seems to be a nice goal, right? If we can focus on that goal and end up with something that works well for that goal, then I think
Kubernetes as an example. I mean,
of course, as an example, it's a well-used example. But for any given thing that consumes or produces configuration, like what could I create that will conform to that? What might I expect from that? Is
just briefly to mention the next modules update call, we had hoped to talk about this in a bit more detail, as we'll announce in the agenda. We've been somewhat sidetracked by the security related discussions about what goes into a module file, and so it's likely that we'll roll that sort of a more detailed presentation on that to the next community update. Excuse me, the next Q modules update, but we'll make that clear in the agenda. Just keeping an eye on the time. Richard, please, over to you.
Yeah, I had a question about the central registry. Is there a plan for discovery, so a search or some kind of web interface that shows a list of modules, and maybe kind of tangentially to what Stephen said, being able to see which modules are kind of the most popular by stars, things like that? All
those things.
Delighted that you asked, Richard. That's exactly Rustam, who's not on the call right now. He is working on an experimental version of that effectively as we speak right now. The idea being that Rog sort of alluded to this. There's quite a lot of unknowns in that documentation space when it comes to Q, because Q is much more complicated than Go, for example. But exactly as you suggested, there's a very large discovery element to it as well as a documentation element to it. So we're kicking the tires on that early. We're going to make that available in the central registry, with the idea being as well, we've had a few inquiries as to whether, we want a sort of a central registry in our company setting as well. Even though it wouldn't be called the central registry, we're exploring what that would look like as well, as like a front end for an OCI within a company setup or a project setup, or just a private setup, I guess. And again, in that situation, a sort of a documentation discovery front end would exist in exactly the same way. So yeah, absolutely, the central registry is going to be our starting point for that, and then we're going to use sort of learnings from the central registry, as it were, to then guide what we work on next and what we prioritize, whether it be on the discovery side, the documentation side. But yeah, great question.
Fantastic. Thank you.
You're welcome. And unfortunately, we won't have a demo of that as we'd hoped for Thursday, because again, as Roger said, we got somewhat sidetracked on the some error handling issues which we discovered with GitLab. So glad to sort of put those somewhat behind us as well, and we can get back to the documentation side of things. Is there any other questions in the -2 minutes that we have unfortunately left ourselves with? Please, whoever that is.
I want to ask Richard, can you clarify? I'm not sure I understand what the issue you think is with 0.10.
I was just wondering about the roadmap. Will there be a 0.10 release, or are we on the road to a 1.0 release after 0.9?
That would be very, very ambitious. I think we will continue to go with the numbers until we will signify when we're going to do a version 1.0 in terms of stability. Just to emphasize, though, and Marcel can perhaps jump in here, with everything that we're doing, especially on the stuff that is classed as non-experimental, with language changes, we will always seek to make fixes available in order that people's code people can heal their code, as it were, with something like qfix or qfumt. With experimental stuff, it's sort of, we've intentionally called it experimental. So the module side of things, we will try not to break people, and we try very hard not to do that. But where it's experimental, we sort of reserve the right to do that. But with the non-experimental stuff, we're trying very, very hard to be stable, even though it is not at version 1 yet. Marcel, I don't know whether you wanted to add anything there.
Yeah, we might also be able to you know, borrow a bit from Go here, where at some point we can say, okay, we you know, include the language version in the modules file, which allows us to actually change the language in seemingly backwards incompatible ways, but it's the language version then that basically tells how to interpret Q. So there are a few changes you know, that we plan that are backwards incompatible. A lot of it is very subtle and minor. Some of it is maybe more substantial, but in all these cases, we can supply qfix, if you will, and maybe even make it in such a way that with the language version, it's compatible either way, right? But there's maybe a few things that might not be easy to do in a backwards compatible way, like the structs, right? Like, so now if you have a closed struct, you can add a definition to it, which is actually not good, but that one is pretty hard to fix. But we should fix that. But other than that, I think there are some ideas on fixing the way numbers work, so relaxing that a little bit, right? Which would be a backwards incompatible change. But yeah, so other than that, I think the changes are much more manageable with versioning and fixes. And we've done it in the past, right, where we automatically move to new syntax, basically.
I had indeed forgotten about the language version, which I think the module side of things automatically, or QModInit already introduces when you do it now. So that's
nice. Go has used that to make a backwards incompatible change recently, right? Like the way iterators work, which was a huge pain for anybody who's used Go a lot. I mean, I've run into it a bunch of times. So that was a change, but it was inherently a backwards incompatible change. But with the Go version they use, they can essentially they could manage that.
We've learned a lot from the Go project, I think, in that sort of phasing of things, which is really, really nice to be able to borrow from their experience. So that's great. Apologies, we've run slightly over. I will suggest if we've got any other questions, if folks are happy to sort of follow up in the discussion or in Slack, we're happy to pick up there. Thank you, and we look forward to catching up next time as well.